Hello. Going to keep this intro short because this is a long video. There's not much theory in this video, just explorations and analysis and some patch walkthroughs. Before we get into it, there's an index in the description as well as links to patch diagrams. Here's a little sample of some of the patches we'll be working on. Alright, Delay Deep Dive Part 2. In the last video, I spent a lot of time on delay time, but really just scratched the surface. So we're going to continue where I left off and go even further with delay time modulation. So if you want to follow along, set your synth up like this. I've got all oscillators set to the same octave, 4 feet, and they're all square waves. Currently oscillator 1's the only one turned up in the mixer, and it's around 10 o'clock, but let's fix that and we'll turn them all up around the same spot. You want this to be a paraphonic patch, so put it into 4 voice mode. And let's quickly just set up something in the envelope generators. We'll bring sustain up about halfway, bring long attack, medium decay for everything, and a little bit of release. And let's tune up the filter, go about halfway. Kind of monkey around with my filter envelope now. A little more sustain, a little longer decay. Okay, so the filter's cutoff's just a little bit past the halfway point, and the envelope amount is at around 2 o'clock. Add some resonance to both of the filters and offset it, so filter 1's got a little higher resonance, and we're going to change the spacing so we have a stereo filter modulation. Great. Okay, almost a year ago, I posted a video about how to use the Matriarch's delay as a makeshift chorus. It's around here somewhere. There it is. So in that video, I go a lot more into depth than I'm going to in this one about chorus. There's some patch diagrams there, as you can see. So chorus is a good place to start, but I'm going to do it slightly different this time. I'm going to turn the delay time up to its fastest, which we learned last time is around 40 milliseconds. I'm going to turn my triangle LFO up to its fastest, so we're into audio rate. And we're going to modulate delay time 1. The attenuator's at 0 right now, so we're not getting any modulation. Let's bring up the delay, a little bit past halfway point. Oh, and I can actually hear that LFO. So I'm going to slow that down a little bit. I'm not sure if you guys are going to be able to hear that. And we'll bring in our modulation. Just love the sound of it when you change the modulation amount. That sound. I don't even know what to call that. Anyway, so there's our dry sound, and there's 50-50 wet dry, nice subtle chorus. Sounds great. I already showed you that if we modulate the modulation amount, we get some nice flangey type sounds, but we're going to get the same thing if we modulate the actual LFO rate. And that, I think, might even sound better. Kind of like a wobbly tape flange. Yeah, that's super cool. So we're going to use the awesome relationship between attenuators 1 and 2 on the Matriarch to dial in some nice subtle changes. And I'll start by modulating the rate of the LFO, which is modulating our delay time. The red trace on the scope is the unattenuated LFO, and the yellow trace is our offset and attenuated LFO. Jeez, the Matriarch always just sounds so good. Barely doing anything and it sounds awesome. Okay, so now I'm going to offset the rate of the LFO. The LFO rate is already at its max with the rate knob fully clockwise, but by using a DC offset, we can push it into overdrive and get even faster rates. I was going to put the output of the LFO through the scope so you could see the rate increase, but it's an LFO at audio rate, so it would just look like a bunch of squiggles, and we wouldn't be able to compare it to the LFO anyway. Okay, let's experiment a little bit with our offset. If we bring it counterclockwise, we'll get into a more traditional FM type sound. But anyway, the point is we're using these two attenuators to really dial in precise modulation. An attenuator and an offset. And that's a real nice wobbly, chorusy, flangy type sound. Lo-fi, I don't know what you'd call it, but I like that sound. Now, if we want a more dramatic one, we can modulate. Ooh, that's definitely more dramatic. We can modulate the attenuator amount. And once again, this is what I did in my delay as chorus patch. But in that patch, I didn't use an offset. So what I'm trying to show you here is just how precise we can be with our modulation if we're patient with these two attenuators. Beautiful. Okay, before we move on, I'm just going to experiment and really try to dial in a tasteful chorus effect. I really like the wobbles you get from a fast LFO, but I want something more subtle, so let's bring the attenuator back to almost 0. There we go. Awesome. Let's bring the oscillators down an octave. You can see how warm this could actually sound. Okay, now we're cooking with gas. Listen to how beautiful that is, but how subtle it is. Wonderful. Cool, let's move on. Okay, let's get rid of all this stuff. We're not going to need the scope for a little bit, and we're going to get back into focusing on that delay, specifically frequency modulation at audio rate of the delay time. So let's go full wet with the delay, and we'll start with a real simple patch. We're just going to make a wobbly tape delay pad. So we're just going to mess around with the LFO rate and try to find something I like. Now, one of my favorite things used to be to use an expression pedal to have control over the rate of the LFO, but I can't show you that because my expression pedal got damaged in their studio flood that happened a couple months ago. But to do that, all you'd have to do is patch the expression pedal out of the back of the Matriarch into the rate input of the LFO, and then you could control the rate with your foot. And that way you can use both hands to play the synth and control the wobbliness with your feet. But let's continue this sort of lo-fi wobbly sound with the arpeggiator. When I'm doing a lo-fi type sounds, I usually like to just stick with one oscillator. So oscillators 2, 3, and 4 are turned down in the mixer. And I want this to be a plucky patch, so 0 attack on both the envelope generators and very short decay times from both of them as well. 0 sustain, of course. And now we can hear that wobble. So lower the cutoff a little bit. We don't need to go too low with the filter cutoff because the delay mix is full wet, and the Matriarch's delay really softens the transients. You get nice, gentle attacks. Okay, now I'm going for a scorched cassette type sound. Lots of wow and flutter, as if it was recorded on a roughed up cassette Porta Studio from the 90s. No, I'll leave the delay time at its fastest, but the feedback will act almost like a reverb as long as it's not too high like that. And because the delay doesn't really react that well to the high registers on the Matriarch, we can get it even glitchier with the higher octave. Okay, that's good. Almost there. I think we just need a little bit more modulation. There we go. Fake Tascam Porta Studio patch. Now, if we bring a little bit of the dry signal back in and adjust our delay time. Let's get rid of that feedback first so we can dial in better delay time. So I don't want it to be an equal division. Okay, bring the feedback back in. And we can get a nice running delay like they used on that show Stranger Things a lot. In fact, I'm going to talk about that a little later on. So let's continue with our frequency modulation. So we're just going to go back to full wet. And I'm going to start bringing the rate of the LFO down. So we're going to get a more traditional FM sound, but we're also going to sort of get a fake carpless strong delay. So that's a more traditional FM sound. Let's go for a carpless strong. There we go. Oh, and you can hear that it's different on left and right. Now we can fix that with spacing. There, now it's unison. Oh, it's out again, but it's just letting some of the dry slip in. Isn't that cool? Now we're getting to more monster sounds. Now it's kind of cool how the dry sound comes in sometimes, but let's get rid of that again with spacing and try to get a unison monster sound. Now we've obviously lost our pitch tracking, but this would be great for just some real ugly percussive type patch. Now of course, the slower we go, the more outer spacey and weird it's going to sound. The drunk R2-D2 patch. Nice. Okay, let's get our scope going again. And I'm just going to set it up the way I did before so that we can check out the LFO. Oh, that's the red trace there. Okay, so scope into the attenuator and second attenuators are offset into the rate input. And so I can hear the effect of the modulation. I'm going to leave it patched into the LFO for the moment, but we're going to use this to modulate the time directly. It's just easier to hear when you're using an LFO, because if it's not subtle enough, you're really going to notice. That does sound cool though. Okay, that's good. So let's patch that directly into the time input on our delay. So very, very subtle modulation of the delay time now. Actually, it's a little too subtle. Turn it up a little bit. And let's bring the mix to about the halfway point. And, oh yeah, I didn't say what I'm doing. I'm modulating the delay time with the sine wave. And what we're going for here is what we talked about earlier, just very subtle time modulation. Now, if I turn up the feedback a little bit, we're going to get that broken cassette type sound again, but a gentler version. And I like having the mix pretty high when I'm doing this as well. Great, that sounds wonderful. Now let's see what happens if we sync it. Nothing yet. We've got to add a little more modulation. Now that's super cool, but we're obviously not getting a wobbly cassette chorus anymore, just some cool glitchy effect. So we have to go into global settings here, and we're going to turn on delay sync CV bend. So the way Moog describes a sync bend is that it bends the delay time relative to its synced position. So the idea is the delay stays synced to the clock, so you keep your division, but depending on how much you modulate the time, you can get a chorus or phasing type effect. It actually sounds really great, so let's try it out. Okay, so this is what our time modulation sounds like without the delay module synced to the arpeggiator, and with it synced. Let's dial in a bit more modulation. There we go. You can hear the little warbles. It sounds great. Let's turn down the feedback so you can hear what it sounds like on a single voice. Cool. That might be the best way to get a tape warble sound. Anyway, let's compare it to no sync bend. And there's our weirdo, glitchy, wonderful Matriarch delay that we've come to love. And let's turn back on sync bend. Yeah, that sounds wonderful. Oops. Okay, as you hear, delay CV sync bend, very useful tool. Sounds great, but let's get back to our frequency modulation of the delay. Okay, we're back to our drunk R2D2 patch, but let's take that LFO back up to audio rate. And I'm going to tune my LFO. There we go. Back to that carpless strong type sound. So that's what we get if we modulate the delay time at audio rate with a static LFO. But let's see what happens if we key track our modulation. And the easiest way to do this is to not even key track it, is to just use the wave out of one of our oscillators to modulate the delay time. So I'm using a square wave at the moment. And it sounds a bit better if the mod oscillator is an octave below our audio source. Okay, let's just program in a sequence quickly. Just something pentatonic, I guess. Okay. Okay, so there's a super easy way to get pitch-tracked frequency modulation of your delay time, to get that weird sounding FM, almost carpless strong-like, while keeping the pitch of your original sequence. And it key tracks great. Okay, but what if you don't want to use one of your oscillators for this, or if you want to use a pitch that's not going to be audible in your sequence? So we need to find another way to do it. So I'm going to go into global settings and just do some future proofing here. Get my sequence CV to mirror the keyboard. And I'm going to patch the CV out of the sequencer into the rate input on our LFO. I'll patch out of the LFO into the molt. I'll show you why. Out of the molt into an attenuator, which is modulating our time. And then out of the molt again into the noise input on the mixer. And this is just so I can easily tune and reference the pitch that my LFO's at. So here's our oscillator, and noise up, and there's our LFO. There we go. So the LFO's an octave below the oscillator, and it's going to key track. Great. Get the sequencer going, and turn off the LFO in the mixer. There we go. So there's our pitch tracking carpless strong type delay. And if we offset the pitch of the LFO a little bit, we can get some more interesting sounds. We don't want to go too low because then it gets into monster territory. Now, a lot of the time, FM is pretty monsterish and harsh, so it's a good idea to filter it. A good filter can make an FM patch way more usable. But if you watch the last video, you know that the delay is after the filter. So I could patch the delay before the filter like I did in the last video by turning delay mix to 0, patching out of one of the full wet delays on the back of the Matriarch into a filter input, patching out of filter 1 into one of the delay inputs, and out of filter 2 to the VCA. But I already did that in the last video, so instead I'll demonstrate how you can change the sound just with the envelope generators, which are modulating the filter and amp and feeding the delay, of course. Okay. So the reason I set up the arpeggiator CV out to mirror the keyboard was just so I didn't need to repatch anything if I wanted to simply audition sounds, and that's what I'm going to do now. I'm just going to use the keyboard to find the nice sounding intervals or pitches that will give me a cool percussive sequence, and then I'll program it into the sequencer. It's a little workflow hack I use all the time. Okay, let's record that. Okay, well that's pretty weird, but we've got a starting point at least. First thing, let's mess around with the envelope generator and tighten it up. Delay time would be fun to modulate. Or sustain for that matter. Let's try it up the octave. Oh, that's much cooler. There's no CV inputs for any of the parameters on the envelope generator. But if I was using a MIDI sequencer to do this, like say Logic for instance, I could modulate the gate length, and I'd get something real similar to what I'm doing now. Okay, let's flip over to the arpeggiator and go for something a little less weird. With the mix knob fully wet and the feedback on the verge of self-oscillation, really sounds great. Okay, with feedback low. Okay, let's bring it back. Yeah, I prefer it like that. Don't even know what to call this. Matriarch Gritty Delay Patch. This, of course, works just as well with the pad, so let's flip it into 4-voice mode. Oops, okay, I'm going to keep sustain up on the amp envelope and go with a long attack time, no decay, so we'll get a fairly drastic dynamic change after the attack. I'll keep the settings similar on the filter envelope generator, but a little less dramatic. While I'm playing, I'm making sure to hit the same key first all the time. That way the FM modulation will stay consistent. Because remember, the LFO rate is still being modulated by the keyboard. Okay, let's see what this sounds like full wet. You can really hear that dynamic change from the amp envelope generator. You know, I preferred this one with a little bit of dry in the mix. It makes it easier to hear the filter modulation before the delay takes control. Okay, let's see if we can come up with something that's really unique. So let's go into global settings, set up round robin mode, G#2, D#0, and E0. Could do D0, which is on with reset, but I'm just going to stick with on all the time. And let's just make sure all our oscillators are slightly different. So I'm going to put them in different octaves just randomly now. And change up the wave shapes. Go with triangle for oscillator 2, narrow pulse, and pulse for oscillator 4. Oh, and make sure that oscillator 2 is in tune. I guess it doesn't really matter. This is going to be a weird patch. And I'm going to use the pitch CV from the arpeggiator to modulate a bunch of stuff. So moving the LFO rate into a mult, and I'll feed the mult with the arpeggiator CV out. So my plan is to modulate the delay feedback with the pitch CV, but I want the feedback amount to be modulated up by lower pitches, not down, so I have to invert it. So I'm going to patch out of the mult into an attenuator, which I'll invert, and then out of the second attenuator, remember not patching anything out of attenuator 1 normals it to attenuator 2, and then attenuator 2 becomes an offset. I'll patch out of attenuator 2 into the delay feedback amount. Now I'll just record a short sequence. This will work best if it's an intervallic sequence. Okay, let's hear what we've got. Okay, well, that's an interesting starting point. You know, I don't think I really needed that offset from attenuator 2, but I patched it already, so it doesn't matter. Okay, let's get this pluckier. I think a slight swell from the attack on the filter envelope would be cool. With most of my arpeggiated patches, especially the plucky ones, I find myself taking a lot of time trying to dial in the decay values. It usually sounds best to me with decay between 0 and the first marker, and that area of the potentiometer doesn't seem to have much precision, so patience and small movements is the key. Okay, let's use sample and hold to modulate the amount of filter modulation. So I'm going to patch that right in there. And add a little bit of glide. And bring a little bit more of the dry signal in. And since I'm using the delay primarily as a sound source, let's add some reverb for some space. Just using a Universal Audio AMS plugin with the plate algorithm. Okay, getting there, but I think this is going to sound better up the octave. Nice. Okay, let's add in a little bit more of the dry sound. Okay, that'll about do it for this exploration of delay time modulation. So to summarize the patch, we've got key tracked FM modulation of the delay time with inverted key track CV modulating the delay feedback amount. So we're just going to experiment for a little bit before we move on to the next idea. You know what, there's one thing I always forget. If you like what you're hearing but it's a little too much modulation going on, sometimes just modulating the second delay channel and leaving the first one unmodulated can settle things down a bit. Alright, we've just spent a while experimenting, so let's build a patch. The idea behind this patch is to use the delay mix modulation we learned in part 1 and combine it with modulating the delay time at audio rate. I'm going to call this one Out of the Ashes. To save time, I'm going to start with the patch pretty much assembled, then we'll go through how it works. So I'm going to start in unison mode, but later we're going to try this in 4-voice mode. The VCA is in amp envelope mode. Oscillators 1 through 3 are all square waves. 4 is a saw, Oscillator 1 is an octave below the others. I've got oscillator 1 turned up a little bit higher in the mixer to bring out some of the lows. For now, the filter's in stereo low-pass mode with cutoff around 2K. Resonance and spacing are all at 0. Key tracking is about halfway up, and filter envelope modulation is at around 3 o'clock. Attack on the filter envelope generator is 0, decay at 12 o'clock, release at 9 o'clock, and no sustain. The attack on the amp envelope generator is around 12 o'clock, decay and release are both around 11 o'clock, and sustain is about 3/4 of the way up. Delay time is fully counterclockwise at its fastest speed, spacing is at 0, feedback is really high, just above 12 o'clock, mix is fully wet. Okay, let's talk about the modulation. We're going to use a sine wave to modulate the pulse width, filter cutoff, as well as a tiny bit of the pitch. So going for a slight vibrato, mod wheel is about halfway up. Okay, now we're getting to the fun stuff. I got the triangle LFO tuned an octave below oscillator 1, just like the patch we just did. It's being key tracked by the sequencer, so CV out of the sequencer to rate input on the triangle LFO. The output of the LFO is going into a molt and then on to the noise input on the mixer, but that's just so I can easily tune or find the rate of the LFO. The noise input on the mixer is at 0, so LFO is not part of the audio path. The LFO goes out of the molt into an attenuator and then is patched into channel 1 time CV input on delay 1. So again, we're going to modulate the time at audio rate. And this last part is the best part. I'm currently using a tip-top molt cable to split the filter envelope out between 2 destinations. But remember, the only reason I'm using the molt for the triangle LFO is so I can easily check the pitch of it. So that molt is not required. So you can just use the molt instead of an external molt if you wish. That's how I'll draw it in the patch diagram. Anyway, so the filter envelope generator out is patched into the molt on the left side of the matriarch, out of the molt into both attenuators, which are inverted. The output of the top attenuator is modulating the CV input of the bottom attenuator, and the output of that attenuator is modulating the mix of the delay. Out of the molt again into the rate input for the sine wave. And lastly, I'm using an external passive attenuator. This is a Splix by Boredbrain Music. Going out of the filter envelope generator into the CV control for the attenuator, which is controlling the amount of triangle LFO modulating the delay time. So the idea is the filter envelope will modulate the delay time, the rate of our vibrato and filter modulation, in other words, the rate of the sine wave, as well as the mix between the dry and wet of our delay. So let's see how this sounds. Cool. Now that's a pretty good start. So hopefully you can hear what's happening with this one. We're morphing between the full wet delay. The delay time is being modulated at audio rate, which is giving us those low, scary, distorted tones, to a clean, dry signal. Okay, let's add in some resonance, and we're going to go for that descending resonant squeal that Rush gets in Tom Sawyer. Here we go. Alright, but that's cut out a lot of our low end. So we could bring back the resonance on one side so that we get a little of those, there we go, a little more of those lows are back in the mix. So there's no CV inputs on the filter for resonance. So we can't patch anything in to modulate that, but of course we can do it in real time by just turning the knob as we play.
But if we want to keep those lows and the squelch, why not use the parallel filter mode? Okay, we definitely got a squelch in those highs. So let's bring down the resonance on the high pass filter and bring down the spacing to get some of our lows back in. And that sounds pretty fantastic. Oh yeah, take a look at the rate knob on the LFO. Remember, our envelope is modulating the rate of our sine wave, which is in turn modulating the pulse width, pitch, and cutoff. It's subtle, but it's there. Awesome. This is a great sounding patch. Okay, let's put it back into double low pass mode, bring the spacing back to 0, and no resonance key tracking back to center. Because now we're going to try it as a paraphonic patch, so we'll switch into 4-voice paraphonic mode. Now, I should have mentioned this before. I am cheating a little bit. I'm using an Eventide reverb, the black hole algorithm, to give it a little bit more space and ambience. So let's try it without that so you can hear what this patch sounds like without any extra help. Okay, we'll turn the reverb off. Okay, it still sounds great. The reverb was definitely helping, but the Matriarch's still the star of the show. Okay, let's take a closer look at what's going on with this patch. So I'm using the filter envelope generator to modulate the delay mix. The attenuator on the left here is acting as a DC offset, so there's our wet mix and our dry mix. So the filter envelope is modulating the CV control of the attenuator. Okay, let me demonstrate that DC offset. So fully clockwise, we're going to get full wet. And counterclockwise, it's going to be dry, or close to dry. Let me get rid of the envelope modulation for a second so you can just look at the DC offset clearly. So I think this is clear. As I'm turning the DC offset, I'm moving from wet delay mix to dry. So I guess there's two questions now. How do we set up modulation so this happens automatically? We don't have to turn the knob physically. And why am I not just modulating the mix knob? Why am I using a DC offset? So I think I'm going to have to take a step back. Okay, so we're starting basically from scratch for a second so we can take a closer look at that modulation. So the only thing I've got patched at the moment is the frequency modulation of the delay time. So that's our delay full wet. So let's take a look at the DC offset on the scope. The red trace is the voltage from our attenuator, or offset, sorry. And you can see it's bipolar, positive and negative values. I always kind of think of a DC offset as one of those old Etch-a-Sketches. Anyway, patching into the mix input. And there's our answer to why I'm using a DC offset. With a DC offset, we can overdrive the mix input. So remember, the DC offset is relative to the position of the mix knob. So with the mix knob around 2 o'clock, I can still get a bunch of overdrive from the DC offset, but I can also get full dry from the delay. Just put it back to center for now. Okay, let's patch in the envelope generator into the scope so we can see how the envelope generator and different envelope shapes will affect our modulation. And let's start with the simplest envelope shape: 0 attack, decay, and release, and full sustain. So you can see with sustain up, our DC offset is up. With sustain down, our DC offset is down, but it's not all the way down. So we have to kind of monkey around and find a balance. That works well there. Just let the scope reset. Okay. Okay, now we need a delay, or in this case, decay, to bring in the dry sound. And there we go. Okay, and then the trick is just monkeying around with the mix knob and the attenuator value to find a value you like. That's too much wet sound still. I'll bring the mix down a bit. There we go. Nice, that works out well. Try a bit more decay. Okay, I think that covers it. Oh, we could add release to make a gentler transition if we wanted. But check out what happens with attack. With a longer attack, the DC offset stays low for a split second, so we hear the dry signal for a second before the decay portion of the envelope. Not crazy about that for this patch, but I guess it could be useful for another one. Okay, I hope that clears things up. Let's get back to the main patch. Okay, I think we've got the idea of how this is working. I really dig the sound of this patch. We could, of course, invert the envelope, and then instead of coming out of the ashes, we could go into the ashes, so modulate dry to wet. Try that. Okay, it works, but need to make some adjustments. So again, it's just about finding a balance between the mix knob position and the DC offset. You know what? I bet a longer attack will actually make this one work a little bit better. Yep, that's doing it. You do hear that little burst of wet at the very beginning of the attack, but it's allowing the dry sound to really come through clean first. Okay, let's try changing the DC offset position and bringing attack down to 0 again. No, that's not working. Decay. Ah, there we go. Okay, just before we call it quits with this one, let's see what it sounds like in parallel filter mode. I'll bring up resonance on both of them to start, bring spacing down to keep those lows. Oops, I had it on high pass. I should bring down the resonance on the high pass filter, lower the key tracking. Nice, you can really hear that notch filter modulation. Sounds awesome. Okay, well that will do it for this patch. I'm just going to play around a little bit and then we'll move on to the next one. The focus of the last couple of videos has primarily been time modulation, but I've still barely scratched the surface. So I'm going to try to wrap things up with time modulation by going through some basic patches and demonstrating the effect of different LFOs on delay time. But really there's so much more you can do with delay time modulation than I've been able to demonstrate in these past couple of videos, so I guess sometime in the future I'll have to do another video about delay time. But for this series, we're just about done with time modulation. We still have to look at a few other things about the Matriarch's delay. Haven't really done anything with feedback yet. So I hope this quick little exploration will give you some ideas, and I'll have to come back to time sometime in the future. All right, let's start with one of the easiest but most effective uses of the delay, just a simple slapback. I'll bring the delay time up to its fastest and start the arpeggiator. Okay, now I'll just bring the mix up on the delay. And we know the delay time is around 35 to 40 milliseconds. And that's fast enough that you almost don't hear it as a delay. You hear it more as thickening the sound. And if we bring up the feedback, it gives it that metallic reverby sound, which is pretty cool. Now, if we keep going with the feedback, the repeats become more prevalent. And if we go far enough, starts to self-resonate, and it sort of sounds like a crappy spring reverb with feedback issues. Anyway, that's super cool. Okay, so let's try to dial in a slapback. Okay, if you're listening on headphones, hopefully you notice the huge change in stereo image there. I'll try to do that again. Yeah, so the delay time is just long enough that it's extending the note length pretty much. Oh, cool. Now we're getting into a sound that I mentioned a little earlier, something they used in Stranger Things a lot. I call it a runaway delay. I don't know if there's a real name for it or not. Anyway, I know for a fact they used a Roland space echo to do it. So I want to see if I can get the same sound on the Matriarch. So first I'm going to patch the Matriarch into my space echo and show you the sound I'm trying to get, and then I'll try to do it on the Matriarch itself. Okay, the level's a bit low, so I'm going to turn up the preamp, get a little bit of saturation. The tape clipping is a big part of this sound, I think. And I'll turn up the echo volume. And now you can really hear that tape saturation. And the fastest time on the tape echo is a little bit slower than the Matriarch. And the intensity is feedback amount, so let's bring that up to the point of self-oscillation. Well, maybe not that much. Okay, now let's slow down the delay time. So I want it to be close to 16ths, but not exactly in time. Yeah, it sounds pretty good there. Let's try a bit slower just to see if that works better. No, that's not good. I was closest the first time. Okay, now if you happen to have a space echo, I don't know if you know this, but if you plug a dead patch into the PA input, you get full wet. So I'm pretty sure that Cal Dixon and Michael Stein, the guys that composed the music for Stranger Things, when they're using the space echo, took advantage of the multiple tape heads. So I'm just going to change my repeat rate now that I'm using 2 tape heads instead of 1. Okay, that sounds about right. The reverb on this thing is really awful, but it's also wonderful. Okay, there we go. Now we're getting that running sound. Cool. I wish I could remember exactly the parts in the show where they use this, but I heard it so often that I remember spending a long time just trying to figure it out. Anyway, it's pretty close now. And I'll get rid of the reverb for now. Okay, and I think I'm just going to crank up the preamp a tiny bit more, just get a little bit more saturation. And I'm going to plug in the dead patch into the PA input again so we can just hear the delay wet. Now the cool thing about this delay is because we're using 2 tape heads, we're getting accents in our delay. It'll be easier to hear if I turn off the repeats. So those are the first repeats. Now as I turn up the intensity or the feedback, all the subsequent repeats are slightly quieter than the original repeats. And when you bring the dry back in, it's got this really cool, like I say, running type sound. Awesome. Okay, so next step is to try to figure out how to do this with the Matriarch. All right, let's start with just getting the arpeggiator going. Bring in the delay. Now, a space echo is a mono delay. So if we want the Matriarch to sound like a space echo, we got to put it in mono, and I'm going to do it the easy way this time and just pan it in my interface. Obviously, if you want this to sound like a space echo, then we need it to be in mono, which is a really important part of the sound of that unit. Nowadays, everything seems to be huge, large stereo fields and spacing. That's, of course, super cool, but there's a definite charm from mono effects, and more importantly for this patch, as you'll see in a minute, it won't work in stereo anyway. Okay, gonna bring the feedback down for a second just so I can hear the delay time a little clearer. And I'm gonna use channels 1 and 2 of our delay on the Matriarch to duplicate the tape heads 1 and 2 on the space echo. Now check this out. Remember, spacing affects the delay time of channel 1 relative to the time knob. With the time knob at 9 o'clock, there's a large range of the spacing knob that's having no effect. That's because time 1 has already been pushed to its maximum delay time. So instead of trying to use time 1 as the fast delay and 2 as the slow one, I'm going to reverse it. And now I'll be able to get closer to the divisions I was getting with the tape heads on the space echo. That sounds about right. I can't really remember what I did on the space echo, but that's close enough for now. And those accents are actually even clearer on the Matriarch than they are on the space echo, so that's kind of cool. So now I'll just monkey around with the time knob until I find a sound I like. Let's hear it full wet. And yeah, I think the divisions are about right. Okay. And there we go. We've got a running delay with accents. Okay, for the icing on the cake, we need some saturation. I could, of course, just use the mixer, but instead, I'm going to take the easy way out this time and just use a plug-in tape simulator. So I'm using the Universal Audio A800 Studer plugin, changing the calibration so there's a little less headroom, and I'm going to bring down the output and crank up the input till it saturates. Okay, let's turn off the delay, and you can clearly hear the saturation now. Cool. I mean, I love the saturation on the Matriarch, but this is definitely closer to the tape echo sound. Cool. Okay, so there's a Stranger Things style tape echo running delay. And you know what? I think I prefer the one on the Matriarch than my Space Echo. Maybe it's time to service that Space Echo. Okay, that was a bit of a tangent, so let's get back to our Matriarch specific patches. Okay, as you can see, I got the LFO patched into an attenuator, also patched into my scope. The output of attenuator 2, I haven't patched it anywhere, but we've got it set up to work as an attenuator with an offset. So we're going to finish off our delay time modulation deep dive and go through a bunch of ideas using different LFOs to modulate the time. The LFO is bipolar, so I'm going to bring the time to the midway mark to start and turn feedback off. Get the arpeggiator going again, and we'll start with a sine LFO. The red trace on the scope is the sine LFO unattenuated. The yellow trace, which you'll see in a second, there it is the output of the two attenuators, which is modulating the time. So what I'm going to do is try to dial in the most subtle modulation I can. And that's pretty cool. Let's see what happens if we try it with a faster LFO. Not so subtle. I'm basically at 0 on the attenuator, but you can still hear it affecting the time for sure. That sounds pretty good. Another wobbly tape style delay or broken delay. Hey, that sounds great. Let's hear it full wet. Yeah, there's just enough modulation that it's got a little wobble to it. Let's see if we can just coax a little tiny more. Oh, yeah, tiny movements. You can see I'm barely even touching the knob. It's really changing it a lot. Okay, well, somebody asked me in the comments how to get subtle time modulation. I think I've showed you a couple other ways, but this is probably the way I'd do it. Now, I'm not using attenuator 2 for anything at the moment. That's an offset. It's basically acting as the time knob. So why use it instead of the time knob? Well, remember the Matriarch has some quirky behavior when modulating the time. The two delay channels don't seem to always get modulated the same amount. And you can clearly hear that now. Oof, the tuning of this is giving me a stress headache. That's actually another Stranger Things technique. Those guys used out-of-tune sequences quite a bit to get some really scary moods. Okay, just gonna experiment for a little bit and mess around. Maybe you'll get some ideas from some of these weirdo sounds. Now, this weird sort of elastic delay sound might sound pretty cool if we're able to sync the LFO to the arpeggiator. So I'll show you what happens if we try that. So you can see the CV is totally changed. It's not even recognizable as a sine wave anymore. It's because the LFO is being reset with every gate signal sent from the arpeggiator. So it just doesn't have time to complete its cycle. But remember, you can always just sync the arpeggiator to the LFO if that's something you really want to try. Okay, let's move on to a saw LFO. And yeah, it's behaving the way you'd expect. I'm just trying to get it close to in time. Yeah, I'm
I'm sure we could probably find a use for this sometime, besides more nightmare music, I guess. Okay, and if we switch to ramp, it's going to do the opposite, obviously. Modulate the time from slow to fast. That's kind of interesting. Let's try it slower. I actually kind of like that. Now, if we wanted to change the modulation, flip it from ramp to saw, we could, of course, use the knob here, but our attenuator can do that too. And remember, we have CV control over the attenuator, so we could set up some patch where it switches automatically between ramp and saw. Okay. Let's move on. We're going to skip pulse wave and we're going to go over to the step triangle wave. So a while back I did a video about the step triangle wave. So for more detailed information, check that video out. But it's pretty self-explanatory. You can see it on the scope. It's a stepped triangle wave that's synced to the clock of the arpeggiator. Okay, and lastly we've got a random slewed wave. This one is great for modulating the delay. Yet another easy way to get random warbles in your delay. You can see how gentle it is. It's like they designed it just for this. Now the slewed wave is not synced to the arpeggiator. So if you want more wobbles, just bring up the rate. And of course we can attenuate this as well. Okay, that pretty much wraps up my quick summary of how different LFOs will affect delay time modulation. Oh, no, I skipped pulse. And for pulse, I am going to get a little bit more in depth. Okay, so for this to work, I am going to sync the arpeggiator to the LFO. So I'm just going to patch out of the back of the Matriarch. Oh, first I'm just going to get rid of this little patch I'm not using. And I'll patch from the malt into the back of the Matriarch into the arpeggiator clock input. And I'll move the LFO, another brain freeze, into the malt. And patch the LFO into the malt. Okay, so now we can see it on the scope and it's clocking the arpeggiator. Okay, so remember you can change the polarity of the LFO in global settings. The default is bipolar, which it's on now, but you can change it to unipolar. The benefit of a unipolar wave when modulating time or pitch, or I guess kind of both in this case, is that a unipolar wave's low point will be the position of your rate knob. A bipolar wave, the knob position is the center point of the modulation.
I'm going to stick with bipolar for this patch, even though it's a little harder to tune because you can get a wider range of modulation. And I'm going to slow us down because this is pretty tricky. I want to try to tune the delay. And you can hear we're getting two different pitches from the left and right delay. So again, our spacing knob isn't quite centered, or the time modulation isn't affecting both channels the same way. But that doesn't matter because I'm going to modulate delay time 2 separately of delay time 1 anyway. So patching the output of the two attenuators into a mult, and I'm going to go out of this attenuator into delay time 2. Of course, patching the mult into the attenuator and then again into delay channel 1. And I'm going to use the attenuator to invert the modulation going to channel 2. That will be the blue trace on the scope. And now the hard part, using the attenuators and the offset to try to find some harmony from our delay modulation. And there's no science to this, it's just experimentation. Okay, to spare you 10 minutes of me slowly turning knobs until I get it in tune, I'm just going to speed this portion of the video up, but that's all I did, just slowly turn knobs until I got it to sound nice. And I'm pretty happy with the result. That's a pretty cool patch. Okay, this really does conclude my summary or demonstration of LFO types modulating delay time. Most of you probably knew all that already, but maybe it gave you some ideas. Since I got the arpeggiator synced to the LFO already, I'll just show you some quick clips of the other LFO synced, then we'll move on to another patch. Okay, let's take a break from experimentation and analysis and build a patch. I got the idea for this one while I was doing that last experiment, syncing the arpeggiator clock to the LFO. So that's what's going on. Well, sort of. It's a little bit more involved, as you'll see in a second. And you can hear the result. I think it's pretty cool. It almost sounds as if the delay time is being modulated, but it's not. It's the feedback. And as the feedback amount increases, we go from single repeats to multiple, so from an arpeggio to chords. Neat. Okay, in an effort to keep this video from being any longer than it needs to be, I'm going to skip the step-by-step setup for this and just talk through it with the patch diagram. I'm using oscillators 3 and 4 as clock generators. To do this, I've patched a DC offset into the pitch input of oscillator 3, which brings it down to LFO rates. Since the oscillators are normal, oscillator 4 is also an LFO. I'm using oscillator sync to sync oscillator 4 to 3. With some patience, you can lock in perfect clock divisions or multiplications this way by turning the pitch knob on oscillator 4.
And that's the reason I chose to use oscillators as clocks. This way, oscillator 3 can be a large division of 4, so a much slower but synced LFO. So I'm using oscillator 4, the faster clock, as the master clock. Wave out is patched to a mult and is patched into the back of the matriarch to the arpeggiator clock input, as well as to the sync input for the LFO. Although at the start of this patch, I'm not going to be using the LFO for anything. Oscillator 3 is a saw wave, and I'm using it to modulate the delay feedback amount. It's inverted by an attenuator, so it's actually a ramp instead of a saw wave. So it modulates the feedback amount from low to high instead of the other way around, which would happen if it was a saw. Anyway, for this patch to work properly, you have to go into global settings and turn off local keyboard control and local sequencer control, which of course detaches the sequencer from the internal routing on the matriarch. So that means we need to patch CV out of the sequencer to the pitch input for oscillator 1, and gate out of the sequencer needs to be multed and patched to the trigger inputs for both envelope generators. Clocking the arpeggiator this way allows us to use the rate knob on the arpeggiator as another clock divider, so set the rate knob to whatever division you like. Oscillators 1 and 2 are acting as normal as sound sources. In this patch I synced oscillator 2 to oscillator 1, both are pulse waves. The rest is simple, dial in whatever settings you want for the filter and envelope generators and have some fun. Okay, let's mess around with this a little bit. Oh, and the red trace on the scope is oscillator 4, which is our clock, and the yellow trace is oscillator 3, which is our modulation oscillator. Okay, this has been playing now for about 3 minutes. You probably get the idea. So let's use that LFO for something. I'm going to patch it into the linear FM input for oscillator 2. That's pretty cool. The saw wave is modulating the frequency of oscillator 2, getting some counterpoint harmony. Nice. But it doesn't key track that well, probably because it's static FM. Let's mess around a little bit more with the frequency of the LFO, see if we can get something a bit nicer. That sounds good. Let's try syncing oscillator 2. That's what I had in the patch diagram anyway. We could experiment with the rate of the LFO. Remember, it's being reset by oscillator 4. That's pretty cool. That's all right. Okay, that does it for this patch. Hope you have some fun with it. Cool. Okay, just messing around a little bit. We've got some more wrapping up to do. I realized I haven't really talked that much at all about the sync button. So let's get the arpeggiator going and back to our C minor triad. And we'll sync the delay to the arpeggiator. That's all there is to it. But first I'm just going to try to get the timing of the synced arpeggiator close to the free running delay. And then I'm going to switch between them so you can hear the difference in tone. Hear that? The stereo image is smaller, narrower. And that's easily explained. Here's the waveform of the non-sync delay, and you can see, although it sounded pretty darn close, there's still about a 2 millisecond difference between the left and right channel. And you'd think that 2 milliseconds is not enough to be audible, but because they're out of phase, we're getting a stereo delay. And here's the waveform for the sync delay, and if we zoom in, oops, it's a bit far. Zoom back out. Yeah, so there you can see it. They're perfectly in phase, perfectly in time. So we're no longer getting a stereo delay, we're getting a mono delay. So that's why, depending on your filter settings, of course, when you hit the sync button, it may seem like you have a narrower stereo image. Your Matriarch's not broken, it's working exactly the way it's supposed to. But that's also the reason why I rarely use the sync button. I prefer to just use the time knob and try to dial in the delay time I like. But the sync button is great for those glitchy sounds. I've demonstrated them a bunch already, but might as well just finish it off and make sure I'm not missing anything. So I'm patching the LFO into an attenuator, into the time input, and into the scope. Okay, let's continue with synced delay time modulation. So there's our triangle wave and our attenuated wave. And let's get some glitchy time modulation going. This is such a unique Matriarch sound. I've heard delay time modulation tons of times on different synths and pedals and even plugins, but they don't even come close to the weird quirkiness that the Matriarch can deliver. You could really spend days or weeks experimenting with this. Obviously, the rate and the modulation depth play a huge role, and little tiny movements can change the patch completely. Okay, check this out. I can't remember if I've showed you this before, but if you sync the rate of the triangle LFO to the arpeggiator, you no longer have a triangle LFO. You get this really bizarre shaped thing. Because with each gate signal received, the LFO is forced to reset, regardless of its position in the duty cycle. So this is essentially a random LFO now. Now, this might not be the most musical example of how to use this, but it gives you an idea, at least. Now, check out what happens to the LFO shape when I bring the rate of the LFO to the first hash mark. So our triangle shape is going to appear, but listen what's happening to our modulation. We're getting positive and negative modulation. I really have no idea how to explain this. It's just super cool. Okay, getting a little bit off topic here. So back to delay, I want to show you a pretty weirdo patch that I like. So I'm going to take the output of the LFO, patch it into a mult, and back into the time input for channel 1. Out of the mult into the attenuator on the left of the Matriarch, which I've already got it set to invert a signal. And out of the mult into the time input for channel 2. Okay, and I'm going to bring the mix and feedback down a little bit. And I'm going to speed up the delay time. Oh, maybe I put the feedback and mix a bit too low. And I'll increase the modulation amount and listen to what's going on the left and the right sides. Now, I love these little subtle glitches. Super cool, but let's make it a little more obvious just for demonstration purposes. I love this. It's glitchy Matriarch slapback. Now, it'd be obviously way more interesting if I was playing something other than a C minor triad, like a nice acid bass sequence or something, but I think you get the idea. A very unique, glitchy Matriarch stereo slapback delay. Okay, let's take one more quick look at delay CV sync bend. That's A sharp 1 and D0 to turn it on. Let's listen full wet. So you hear it, the glitchiness is gone. Just another flavor of slapback. Okay, just so that we can check all the boxes on our deep dive list, let's quickly take a look at the divisions available with sync delay. I'll just bring the feedback down so this is easy to hear, and we'll bring the clock way down. Okay, with delay at its fastest time, it's as close as you can get to 1-to-1. So I'm just going to go through the different divisions so you can hear them. Now you may have noticed that since we've been in sync mode, the time LED has changed colors. I never really pay attention to that because I'm colorblind, but when it's not synced, it's red, and when it's synced, it's green apparently. And it's yellow if it's synced to an external clock. Anyway, you can hear the divisions. There's even and odd divisions, in other words, quarter notes, triplets. I think there's even sevens, like 5/7. And the Matriarch's delay does a great job of keeping in sync to the arpeggiator, especially for a fully analog synth like this. Okay, I think you get the idea. It's easy to sync the arpeggiator to the delay. Oh, in the last video, Deep Dive Part 1, I talked about ways to get longer delay times. This is yet another one. If you sync the delay to the arpeggiator, you can go beyond the 750 milliseconds they list in the manual. And once you get to those slow times, you're going to get those lo-fi metallic delays again. Okay, and the last thing I can think of to talk about with this sync button is that it does function as a tap tempo button as well. So we'll start the arpeggiator. Keep it slow so we can hear this clearly. Now if I hold the sync button down and then tap 3 or more times, we have a tap tempo for our delay, which is independent of the arpeggiator, by the way. And while you're in tap mode, if you tap different tempos, it's going to stay in tap mode. Let's try something super slow. You have to tap 3 times in a row at a relatively consistent pace. Oops, consistent. There we go. And that's really all there is to that. It's obviously a handy function for live performance. Okay, I think that does it. I think we can finally put time modulation to bed, at least for this series. Okay, if there's anybody still watching, I've got one more patch for you, and I think it's the best patch I've come up with in a while, so let's get to it. Okay, I'm going to put together a Chord pulsar patch, and I'm going to need a clock divider for this. Or at least 2 clocks that are synced. So let's take a look at what happens if we try to sync the Mod Bay LFO to the sequencer. So I just patched the gate out of the sequencer into the sync input on the LFO and out to my scope. And so we can hear the LFO should modulate something, maybe the pitch. No, that's going to be weird. I'm just going to modulate the filter instead. That'll be easier to hear what's going on. Okay, let's get the arpeggiator going. Oh, and remember, if you play more than 4 notes, the arpeggiator can act as a sort of on-the-fly step sequencer. It's not written in the manual, it's just one of the cool things that's hidden on the Matriarch. The red trace on the scope is the LFO, and at the moment it's just sending a high voltage signal. It's not moving at all. You can see that with that little LFO light, it's not blinking. So if you're trying to sync your LFO to the arpeggiator and you don't hear any modulation, you might just have the rate knob turned down too low. Syncing analog LFOs is not like digital. They're almost never 100% in sync. Okay, so let's turn up the rate of the LFO and we'll get it moving. There we go. And it's doing what it's supposed to. It's syncing the rise of both waves. But you can see the fall of the LFO is a little later. I'm going to zoom in a bit on the scope so we can see that clearly. And of course we're not hearing too much modulation because the LFO is the same tempo as our clock at the moment. As I increase the rate of the LFO, we sort of are getting two divisions, or I guess I should say multiplications, but they're not exact multiplications. Zoom in again. The LFO is basically running independently of the arpeggiator, but being told to reset every time it receives a high gate signal from the arpeggiator. That's why we're getting those little half waves. So with some patience, you can dial in some pretty neat sounds that you wouldn't be able to do with a digital LFO unless it had phase adjustment, but it's very hard to get exact multiplications. Getting close now though, let's see how close I can get it. Okay, that's pretty close. Anyway, you can't divide a clock with an LFO, only multiply the rate. So this is not going to be right for this patch, at least the way I want to do it. So I'm going to patch the LFO to the amp envelope trigger input. So I'm going to keep the LFO as our master clock. And I'm going to go into global settings. And it looks like, yes, my global settings are frozen again. When this happens, I just hit the highest black key and it seems to get things going. So I'm going to change the polarity of the square LFO to unipolar. Honestly, it's not really going to make a difference in this case. I'm just sticking with tradition that typically gate signals are unipolar. Okay, so the LFO is going to be our master clock, but I do need a second clock, so syncing the arpeggiator to the LFO by patching into the sync input on the back of the Matriarch. It's easy to remember the position of the sync input because it's almost directly behind the oscillator 1 in on the mixer. So now the rate knob on the arpeggiator becomes a division knob. So if everything works properly, we should be able to easily divide our master clock now. But first I've got to mult our LFO out. So I'm patching out of the LFO out into a mult, which is then going into the sync input, and out of the mult again into the trigger input on our amp envelope generator. So the red trace again is our LFO. Let's turn on the arpeggiator. Okay, so you can already hear the division from the filter modulation, but let's patch that into the scope anyway. I might as well patch the output into the filter envelope generator trigger input. At the moment, the Matriarch's internal routing is already doing that, but I may detach the arpeggiator from the internal routing later with global settings, so I'll patch it in to be safe. Okay, you probably don't even need the scope. You can hear it just with the filter modulation that our LFO is being divided by 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Anyway, that's pretty clear, and you can see it on the scope that the divisions are bang on. Okay, that's working, so let's dial in some filter envelope modulation. Remember, the filter envelope's being triggered by our second clock, the arpeggiator in this case. I want to time the attack and release, so we're getting a little swell at the beginning of each trigger, but it's gone before the next pulse. Okay, let's see how well this thing divides the LFO. All right, 8. I think maybe I'll stick with 8 for now. And with the slower division, I can make my envelope a little bit longer. Cool. Okay, let's set up our voices. I want this patch to be a one-note chord patch or a one-hit, whatever you want to call it. So I'm turning up the oscillators in the mixer and tuning to a chord I like. Got a fifth from oscillator 2, and let's go for a minor third and octave up from oscillator 3. That's good. And let's just double that fifth and octave up with oscillator 4. Ooh, tritone. Let's just go with a fifth. And just do some tweaks with the mixer and the balance. Okay, let's sync the delay to the arpeggiator. Remember, it's the arpeggiator that's the slower clock in this case that we're syncing to. That sounds good. What are we getting here? Quarter notes? Yeah. Let's just experiment, see if we find something like better. Nope. Actually, that is kind of cool. stick with that. Well, you know what? I did like that other one. Let's try that again. And you can hear the delay time knob when synced to a clock gives you a lot of clear divisions. It's actually really precise, so that's good. You know, it's hard to hear with all this feedback. Let's turn the feedback down for a second to figure this out. Yeah, quarters is definitely the best for this. And I'm going to try to time the feedback so we get repeats going up right until the next pulse, but not overlapping. I think that's got it. So this sounds pretty good already. You could do this without syncing the delay, just dial in the delay time with the delay knob and not sync it to the arpeggiator, but that might be a little tricky to get it exact. And the point of this patch is to modulate the delay time, but to keep it synced, so that scratches that idea. Okay, so I'm going to use the filter envelope generator envelope end out, which remember is the one being triggered by the arpeggiator to modulate the time of the delay. So I've got it patched into an attenuator to control the amount of modulation and out of the attenuator into time input for channel 1 of the delay. And I'll start with just a little bit of modulation. The envelope end out is a gate signal, so theoretically I should be able to create a repeating pattern, and with some patience and small moves with the attenuator should be able to keep it in the same key. Okay, let's play around with the delay time again now that it's being modulated and see if we can find something a little cooler. I like that. We got our quarters back. Nice. Okay, we should probably talk a little bit about the envelope end out. Okay, so if you follow my channel, you may have already seen the video about the end of envelope out I just posted. It was originally a part of this video, but I cut it to keep the length of this one down a bit. In that video, I go pretty deep into how the output works, so you may want to check that out. I'm just going to do a quick summary here. So the Matriarch's manual explains it pretty clearly. Once the filter envelope generator has run its course and returned to its lowest level, a gate signal is created and continuously output via the jack until a new envelope cycle is initiated via keyboard or trigger input. Okay, easy peasy, it creates a gate signal. But let me explain what I want to try to accomplish with this gate signal. I want the delay time to skip down to a slower division so the pitch of the delay is lower, but I want it to be in time and I want it to only happen for a short period of time. So to do that, I need a gate signal that's synced to a clock. I've already got that, so far so good. But what I need to accomplish now, or what I need to fine tune now, I guess, is the gate signal sent by the end of envelope gate output. I want a gate signal with the gate low most of the time. When the gate is low, there's no modulation, so that would reflect the position of the delay time knob, in this case, quarter notes. But I need the gate high signal to be short. I only want to modulate the delay time for a short period, so the delay produces some low notes, but maintains the overall harmony. So how do I do that? The gate signal from the end of envelope out is low when the envelope receives a signal from the trigger input, as long as decay, sustain, or release are not zero, of course. The envelope end out will send a high gate signal after the envelope has completed its cycle, or whenever it's not receiving a signal from the trigger input. If you watch my other video, you know that this also happens if you have a really high attack value on your envelope generator. So in short, what I need is an envelope with a long release to keep the gate low for most of the time, with a medium to short attack, so it opens at the beginning of the trigger signal, but still opens, and with a fairly short decay time. Okay, back to the patch. Let's patch this into the scope so we can have a better look at what's going on. So I guess I'll patch out of the attenuator into the scope, so we'll see the attenuated version of our end of envelope out, and of course patch that back into time modulation so we can hear what we're doing, and turn on the scope. The blue trace is going to be our modulation from the end of envelope. There it is. So now I'm going to play around with the filter envelope generator values until I get what I'm after. I'm actually pretty close already. Having a scope makes this easier, but really you need to use your ears to find what you're after. The scope is good for diagnosing problems and figuring things out, but ears win every time. Remember, this might be a little bit counterintuitive. When the gate is high, the time is modulated slower, so we get lower pitches. When we are getting the lower notes, they're soft, but they're there. Those cool glitchy high notes are caused by the time being modulated quickly and the delay sync catching up. It's a cool side effect. I like it. I thought I was going to have to make a much longer release time, but it's actually working out pretty well. So the attenuator is controlling the amount of modulation, so let's mess around with that a little bit. It's obviously going to affect the depth of modulation, so in this case the pitch. So with less modulation, smaller pitch changes. And just tiny, tiny, tiny little movements make a big difference with this. And I think this is about where I started, and it sounds the best, so we'll keep it there. And now just monkeying around a little bit with the feedback amount. Again, I want those pulses to continue to the next swell or trigger from the filter envelope generator. And in terms of the mix, it'd be nice if they're pretty good balance between the wet and dry signals. And you can hear it's working. So when I'm modulating the sequence, the delay is modulating as well, and it's staying pretty close to the same interval, so that's working out great. Awesome. I want to try to get those low notes in the delay to be a little bit more prominent, so a little bit more decay from the filter envelope generator. And just for fun, even though I like this pattern, I'm going to try some different divisions from this one's not as good. Different divisions from the arpeggiator is what I was trying to say. So this is a slower division. What is it? 12. I think that's working better than the 8. Do some little tweaks with the filter. A little bit more envelope modulation, and I'm going to offset the resonance on the sides just a tiny little bit so we get a little bit more of a wider stereo field. And I'm going to crank up the release time on the filter envelope generator because that's what I thought I was going to have to do the first time anyway. Yeah, so that's making our low gate signal longer, and I think it's making our modulation in this pattern at least a little more stable. I think the feedback's a little long because you hear those low notes do one extra repeat, then it sounds natural, but I'm going to leave it like that for now, and instead I'm going to mess around with some more filter modulation to get a little bit more life. So I'm going to use the triangle LFO. I'm going to patch it into the mult, and we're going to use it to modulate both of the filters, left and right. So out of the mult into both of the attenuators on the left of the matriarch, and I'm going to use the attenuators to offset the filter modulation. So out of both of the attenuators into the CV inputs for both of the filters. And I'll slightly invert attenuator 2 here, so that's going to the right side. And attenuator 1's doing the left, and let's turn up our LFO a little bit and see what happens. Cool, stereo filter modulation. Oh, it's a little bit too much though. Okay, well, I was hoping that an LFO at an independent rate would really liven this up. But instead, I think it's making it a bit messier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sync this LFO to our master clock. Don't like having everything in sync because sometimes rhythmic unison is really kind of boring. But I think we need to do it this time. And when you sync the triangle LFO, it acts kind of wacky anyway, so it might actually work better. Yeah, that's working out pretty cool actually. Now we're really getting a good left-right modulation, especially with those lower notes. Okay, that's the patch. Could process this with a compressor to bring out those lower notes a little bit better and even out the dynamics, but this has been a long video, so I think I'm going to call it there. Thanks for watching.